Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy Friday to learn a little with us today. My name is Jeff Evelyn. I'm with TxMQ. This is our first webinar in the Work Smart with IBM MQ webinar series, which we hope to have quite a few more throughout this year. If you're not familiar with TxMQ, we're a consulting, staffing, and development shop. We focus a lot in the middleware space. Among the many technologies that we work with, IBM MQ is really something a lot of us are passionate about here at TxMQ, and just wanted to take some time and share some of the important information with you today on upgrading IBM MQs with best practices. Today I have John Carr. He's a senior consultant with the TxMQ team, and he's on with us today, and he's put together a great presentation. I'm going to throw it over to John and let him take it from here.
I am a senior consultant here at TxMQ, and we're here to try to help you be able to work smart with IBM MQ. For the presentation overview, this is really just based off of experience that I've had working out in the field with several clients, migrating from like version 7 to version 9, or even version 8 to version 9, distributed in several different places. We'll cover some of the best practices that we ended up employing along the way. Um, I like using the word "we" because it is a team and collaborative effort. But these are some good practices that I ended up uh, uh, employing too, and hopefully you enjoy it as well. Presentation main section will be basic considerations to go through and think about. A cross section of an MQ version 9 in production. We'll go through and review that too. I end up calling that a reference implementation. And it seems to be something that always seems to be lacking with IBM and others, is to actually go through and provide a true reference implementation that you could be able to go through and have a look at. So here at TxMQ, we went through and put one together for you. There's also a bonus section in here for independent study, for compatibility, and then a walkthrough of a simple lift and shift migration as well. I ended up making it a bonus section because it's a little bit more wordy, a little bit more detailed, and that's something that you could be able to go and review on independent study as part of after our presentation here. You could be able to download this. For basic considerations, the one wordy slide that I really have here, I just want to go and bring up just up front with MQ91, and this comes directly from IBM as the source, that includes features that were previously delivered in the CD release, continuous delivery release, and I'll explain a little bit about that shortly, of MQ 901 through 905, along some minor enhancements. As part of the MQ Advanced Entitlement, uh, that comes with a high availability for disaster recovery options with replicated data queue manager support, also more flexibility in packaging and deployment with enhanced control of MQ MFT, just to go and cover a few of those things. And also new capabilities for the base and advanced clients, powerful and flexible configuration and operational tooling options for the MQ console, increased logging options. So now we've all been used to circular and linear, and now there's a new flavor for that as well. And then, believe me, with each one of these right here, we could go through and have a webinar just by itself. And we'd like to go and hear from you, even through your feedback about what you'd like for us in future Work Smart with MQ webinars, what you'd like us to go and have topics on. The REST API for messaging, this is also something that's seems to be more and more popular. And even with Xeos Connect Enterprise Edition, if you're familiar with that, that even allows MQ to have an API front end as well. So you're seeing more and more shops having interest in communicating with their queue managers via REST API. For MQ client compatibility, Another little bit wordy slide, but I just wanted to go and bring this up from the IBM source, which is always great for any of us who have ever worked with MQ. The thing that we learned is pretty much, they've always been great with the backwards compatibility, where with any version of MQ you have, whether it's 9.1 going all the way back to version 7 or even version 6, that those channels could be able to be used for communicating between the queue managers. So in other words, a version 7, 8, or 9 clients can connect to version 7X, 8, or 9 queue managers. Version 7, 8, or 9 queue managers can interact with version 7, 8, or 9 clients. And definitely in our type of world, it's never everyone being able to go through and upgrade at the same time, even their own MQ network. So that's one thing that all of us who've worked with MQ has been very thankful about, is the client compatibility. And in the bonus section, I have more information about that, including cipher specs and stuff that you could use. CD versus LTS. So for LTS, and this is actually important as part of a best practice to go through and decide which to go and use. I think now this concept has been out long enough for people to go through and understand that CD is considered a continuous delivery every couple of months. It's intended for customers wanting to explore the latest features that would be available for MQ. It's released every few months. When moving over to a new CD version, you have to uninstall the binaries in favor of the new CD. QManager or diff should not be impacted by this. The release is supported for the lifetime of the related LTS that the CD is part of. With long-term support, it's supposed to be it demands the highest levels of stability, because LTS is definitely something that would be truly meant for production environments. It releases approximately every 2 years, and release is supported for at least 5 years. And believe me, something as simple as this, many clients go through and will ask, well, which one should we go through and we use? Well, decision to go in and using CD or LTS depends on the size of your supported MQ network. But approach this with caution. It will drive how you build and maintain your environments. In a nutshell, stick with LTS because of the needed stability and predictability that you want in your network. What you can do is, as an example, you could go through and be able to create an environment that would end up supporting both, let's say. And as an example right here, you could go through and you could have a sandbox that would be for, let's say, version 9.1 LTS, and then you could go through and you could create parking lot sandboxes for 9.1 CD. And what this will then allow you to do by having these parking lot queue managers and environments sitting out there, virtual machines, if you wanted to then go through and explore some of the newer features, then you could be able to do so within like a parking lot sandbox. And sometimes that could be quite desirable if you did want to see if there was a feature within CD that you're interested in just at least previewing before the next roll up, like before 9.2 comes out. Another thing to go through and consider is in-place installs versus side-by-side versus fresh installs. In-place install, what that basically does is it's installing version 9 as an upgrade to the version 7 installation or version 8 on the same server, essentially replacing the binaries. Afterwards, when the queue manager has started, it should be migrated to the new version. Another option is a side-by-side install, where you have 2 code bases on the same server, and then you set MQM command to be associated with whichever queue manager base that you're working with. A fresh install would be always new provision server with MQ9 code base installed. We'll we'll have to create a new queue manager and copy the object diffs from the existing queue manager to this new one. And almost all the time, um, even I go through and I recommend just a true fresh install, because as part of a fresh install, it'll get rid of any type of, it gives you a chance to get rid of any type of artifacts that may be in the previous environment. As part of a new install, as you know, with the operating system, it'll also include any type of operating system fix packs that come along with that, and be able to go through and refresh your environment. If you're going into the cloud, especially with dealing with rehydration, like with AWS rehydration, every 45 or 60 days, and it will be an in-place install that definitely you want to go through and follow with that. So on-prem or even out in the cloud, I'd still go through and recommend doing a fresh install over the other options. Naming standards. This right here is, and I like bringing it up because a lot of people that I encounter, they really don't think about naming standards when it comes to not just their servers, but their queue managers as well. The easiest way to go and think about this is cattle, not pets. When you have a pet has a personalized name. It's unique and special and cared for. Okay, a cattle has numbers assigned to it. I call them branding. Um, they're usually identical, replaced, and they could be easily replaced when it's not in good health. And I bring this up because, and everyone has their own example on this. You can go into shops, and some of them will end up naming their queue managers over the 7 dwarves. You know, um, sneezy, bashful, things like that. And in the end, you want to be able to go through, and instead of giving them personalized names, you want to go through and treat them more like cattle. That's my opinion on that, and I think that works great, whether you're a small shop or a larger shop. And I'll tell you, especially as you're thinking about moving to the cloud and you're still dealing with on-prem queue managers, start approaching this as treating them like cattle, because when that day comes that you do want to go and migrate to the cloud, you'll already have those standards in place. Always remember the basic standards: server naming, queue manager naming, even port ranges as well, environment designations, or designations, and whether or not you're using virtual or physical servers. This presentation doesn't go into the cloud unique issues in dealing with MQ. So in talking about this in general terms, I'm talking one in general terms and two more for on-prem type implementations or upgrades. Organizing your environment. Again, this goes back into treating your environment like cattle, not pets, where you go through and you would be giving designations to not just your servers, but also to your queue managers as well. And here I go through and I provided a general example that I just whipped up. And every shop will go through and have their own standards on what they want to call their servers and their queue managers. Another best practice that I say is don't call your queue manager the name of your server. In the end, you want them to be unique, as you go through and see here. And especially, and I know I've been on call a lot in my life too, when you're looking at something at 3 in the morning, if you're used to a certain branding for the servers and for the queue managers, when you look at it, you can almost go through and be able to go through and tell what is the features of the server. Is it a physical or a virtual server I'm working with? Which environment is a part of? What type of queue manager is this? And then even with the ranging as well, with a series, they could go through and have different meaning for you and your team. Again, this is something that a lot of people really discount and maybe not give a lot of thought into, but as you could go through and see, as part of any best practice, make sure that you get down your organizing of your environments. Here's an example with Queue Manager numbering schemes, where if you're dealing with DMZ type servers, you go through and you give them a number. Core servers, you give them a series number, and proof of concepts, you even give them a series of numbers as well. Organizing your environment is also very important as part of a best practice, where, and this is maybe more implies for on-prem than with cloud, but you would go through and you could have like a packaging sandbox or a parking lot. And remember, for the parking lot queue managers, I was mentioning, those could be used for the CD releases. And then package sandbox, of course, would be, and everything else would be for your LTS. Other things would be going through and breaking out between what you call your non-prod, your stage, and your prod environments. And by going through and grouping things like this, then you could be able to go through and better organize who needs access to what, or even being able to go through and divide out your team on who's responsible for which environments as well, by doing some basic things like this. It doesn't matter if you're a large organization with 1,000 or 2,000 queue managers that you're working with, or a small organization with only 5 or 6 queue managers. By working out a strategy like this on what you consider your non-prod, your stage environments, and your prod environments will definitely be able to help you with the promotion of your MQ objects. Now, right here, this section I go through, and I basically call it a reference implementation in a production setting. And going through and showing something like this will kind of give you an idea of how MQ could be used in production. And every shop goes through and they do things a little bit differently. Some shops may go through and use NetScaler instead of F5, for example, for any type of balancing. Other shops may not even have that. They just may go through and use MQ clustering completely. So this is just more of a sophisticated example of messaging service in a nutshell, where applications, we use a secure channel to go through and connect to a queue manager, and then an application would not know the location of the queue manager because it's going through, let's say, a NetScaler or an F5 switch, as an example. LDAP authorization and authentication, ever since, I think it started in version 8, I believe now, that's when it started, when you could start using LDAP for authentication and authorization, and we'll get more into that into this presentation, as opposed to just using OS level security. This is something that's a growing trend, something for you to be able to go through and consider as well. Other considerations to go through and do is with a queue manager to go through and not just have everything go through one port, but to have many ports out there. As an example, for a listener, you could go through and have a queue manager that would have 3 listeners, one for the applications, another listener for if you're dealing with MQ clustering, for the clustering traffic, and also even an admin or a utilities port as well. These are also things to go through and consider when we talk about cattle versus pets. As you notice right here, I'm trying to treat my server and my queue manager more like cattle, where in the event that this thing gets sick and I need to even replace it, it's easier to be able to do so when I have a strategy as such. Or if I'm having an issue with an application, where I would say that we want to go through and isolate issues. We want to disconnect them for a while we're going and looking within the queue manager through our own utilities. We could be able to do so without interrupting any other traffic. Now, there are different strategies that you could go through and use with, like, turning off a channel, for example. But this is a practice that when I go to different shops, I try to go through and suggest and follow. Queue manager organization, as I say, it's very important to come up with some type of strategy to go through and identify through a numbering series of what type of queue manager is this for. It could represent physically whether it's part of a DMZ. It could be representing certain types of lines of business or applications. This is something that you could be able to go through and have a larger discussion with your team and even other players to go through and decide what would be a good numbering strategy to be able to work from. Especially for LDAP. Most shops have at least 2 LDAP servers, one that would be sitting in DMZ, the other would be sitting in a non-DMZ environment. And then there would be different LDAP operational domains that will drive different setup for your AUTHREC and AUTHINFO. And I got a few examples for dealing with those in this presentation. Here we're getting a little bit more into the meat as part of best practices, where when you're dealing with a queue manager listener port, and then remember, treating things like cattle, not pets, you come up with a strategy where your MQ objects for listeners and channels, or where it makes sense to give a branding name that uniquely identifies the object. And as here, I give a spec, for example, dealing with a listener, where it would go through and have queue manager name underscore port. And here, go through and give somewhat of an example if you're trying to go through and write that out as part of an MQSC command. Again, it doesn't have to follow a strategy like this. You could go through and employ a strategy that makes sense for your organization, but think out a strategy and make sure that you follow through with it with each and every queue manager that you work with. Um, uh, More of a word that you might hear in the industry is what's called snowflake. Snowflakes, as everybody know, are unique. So you don't want to go through and have, if you're dealing with a network of 50 or 100 or thousands of queue managers, have them snowflaked where each listener is named differently, each channel. There's no consistency between them when you go through and work between your different queue managers. You'd like to be able to have that consistency, and that's why we keep talking about cattle, because it makes branding a lot easier to be able to work with, and also great for your support team to maintain as well. An example here for channels would be each application will go through and have its own channel to connect. Don't let apps share channels, especially when dealing with SSL ciphers. So you would want each application to have its own independent channel. You don't want to have 2 or 3 applications share the same channel. Give each one of them their own. And don't forget, give it some type of branding. An example here is like the app name underscore some type of a qualifier. Here, as a simple example for authorization and authentication, authentication uses the AUTHINFO object. Definitions are used to connect to the LDAP server. Authorization uses AUTHRECs, and you run these within your run MQSC environment. The definitions for what users and groups will have access to which MQ objects. And I'll try to go through and give somewhat of an example within here. Define a Windows. When you're dealing with Active Directory, the best practice, or what seemed to work well, would be to go through and define a Windows global group access specifically for use with MQ. Ideally, create 2 groups, one for a non-prod and one for a prod environment. Define a Windows application ID and associate it with the group for non-prod and prod as well. And then go through and give examples as they provide the ID and group information for the MQ information to MQ admin and authorization as well. So the MQ admins could use LDAP search on the user ID for from the command line to be able to go through and inspect the results. And in fact, when it comes to this right here, especially for authorization and authentication, this is something that could be a webinar just by itself to go through and step through several examples on. And this has always been true, at least from my experience working on the last 3 or 4 clients, is that there is a 12-character restriction for the group user IDs being used with MQ. So when you go through and you give your user IDs and your group IDs, make sure you stay within this 12-character restriction. I'm not sure if version 9.1 ever resolved that, but it was a gotcha for those of us who started going through and started using LDAP, and so that's always stuck in my mind. AUTHINFO. And there is a difference between authorization and authentication. Authentication, I should go through and say, authentication is basically, in my mind, when a user, I would say like user 1, does he have access to this queue? Is this person authorized to even go and connect to my queue manager? And then authorization would be more of which objects within this, or what kind of actions can they be able to go through and perform within this queue manager. So number 1, can they connect to this queue manager? And then number 2, if they can, as part of authorization, what can they do with the objects in this queue manager? Can they put messages to queues? Can they get messages? What can they do, or can they only browse? These are things as part of granularity that you want to go through and consider as well. As an example, for AUTHINFO here, create 2 AUTHINFO objects. Assign one to for the queue manager con auth. Passwords change 60 or 90 days. And when you're dealing with AWS as well as part of the rehydration process, that you're going to be experiencing this a lot too. And I think that's like every 45 days, if I remember right. Good practice to do this because you could schedule better password changes by using a second AUTHINFO. And then as part of our goal, we always want to be able to have less service interruption. We don't want to be able, we want to have as minimal as possible any type of service interruptions. For the AUTHRECs, and this AUTHRECs are more of what type of authorization are we going to go through and allow this user or this group to have. This goes into the fine grain versus coarse grain, as I mentioned in the last slide. Fine grain would be specific access only to what's needed by the app. For example, get and put for a certain user. Coarse grain would be cast a wide net for access to a group of objects. As an example, all queues beginning with, let's say, app1 dot anything could be all MQI for a user group. Now, not going through and saying, don't allow them to have everything that they could be able to do. Maybe you want to go through and think about that a little bit, saying, for this group, we only want them to be able to get or inquire, and this other group, we want them to be able to go through and put, and I'll show you that in an upcoming slide. Combinations thereof, here we go. Combinations would be to use a common sense approach to your security. Give an application authorization for what it needs. Okay, what is the application's purpose? Here, I'm going to give an example. A business app needs to be able to connect to a queue manager. It needs to be able to get messages from queues starting with app.in or anything that is prefixed with app.in. You need to be able to go through and browse messages from another app's local queue called app2 audit queue, as an example. Put messages to queue called app.app2.poq as an example, or even being able to go through and publish to a topic, or even be a subscriber. So this is kind of like an application inventory to go through and say, what is it that with this application who is using my queue manager, what is he using it for? And this is where you could turn around and work out what access that application needs. Nowadays, just as important as any type of cybersecurity, you want to make sure that they have the appropriate authorizations. You don't want one application to be able to go through and put messages onto a queue that it's only meant to get messages off of, as an example. The more you know about an app using a queue manager, the better you could grant only the necessary access. Here, as an example, for AUTHREC, for connecting to queue manager, a business app needs to be able to connect to a queue manager. So here I go through and I provided an example for the MQSC command to go through and show for this app group, he needs to be able to inquire and connect to this queue manager. The other thing is that business app needs to get messages from queues starting in app.in, any kind of queue that begins with app.in. So best practice would be using wildcards for those queues meant as input to a specific app. Here, I go through and give an example of the set AUTHREC that you would be able to go through and set for this specific group to indicate that they're only able to inquire or get messages. AUTHREC browse a queue. Business app needs to be able to browse messages from another app's local queue called app2 audit queue. In this case, he uses a profile to get the actual queue objects as if it's its name. And this is generally when you're going through and you actually, as part of a best practice, if you're going through and giving a fully qualified MQ object name, it, it should be like for a local queue as an example. So best practice, be specific when granting and don't use wildcards when browsing. So here I go through and I give my example. App2 audit queue for the AUTHREC for this group, and I'm going through and saying, no, you could go through and you can inquire and browse. Being able to go and put to a queue. This business app needs to be able to go through and put to a specific queue. You know, it's meant for local, remote, and clustered queues. Best practice, be specific when granting and not use the wildcards. So here, again, I go through and I provide an example of the MQSC on how to be able to do something like that. AUTHREC, to be able to go and put to a queue, because you may need to move app2 to another queue manager someday and use a clustered queue, as an example. When specific, with the AUTHREC put permissions, then you don't need to change. So if app1 wants to put a message to a queue, it really shouldn't have to know the location of that queue. So as an example right here, we have an application is connecting to his queue manager that he knows about in its simplest terms, and then he's going through and he'll be ultimately putting a message to an alias queue that will end up going through and point to in the clustered queue an app2 PO queue as an example. Other considerations for best practice, start thinking about anything connecting to a queue manager as an application, whether that's your MQ monitoring agent, IIB and ACE, or application performance management tool. Treat every one of these guys as if they were an application too. So what that means is they should go through and run under their own IDs. They should have their own authorization and authentication to be able to go through and connect to the queue managers. They'll need to have AUTHREC set for them too. Doing this, you'll be able to have a healthy, happy MQ ecosystem. And I know that was quite a bit to go through and cover. And I just want to see if at this point there was any questions or the questions I could be able to answer for you guys.
If anybody has any questions, if you look, I believe it's in the lower part of the dashboard, you should be able to click on that Q&A and type in any particular questions you guys might have. So just kind of wait a second or two to see if anything pops up here. Okay, so I don't see any questions. I know we went over a lot of information. John, very much appreciated. I know you got a pretty busy schedule, and that was some great information that you gave us. So this concludes this afternoon's presentation. We're going to have the recording, as well as the slides available for download sometime in the next week. So if you're interested, keep an eye out in your email for a link, and we'll be sending that out. Of course, feel free to share that with other folks and colleagues on your end. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, and hope you were able to take away maybe a little bit of something from this. And stay tuned for more in the future. We definitely plan on building on this. And you guys have a great weekend.
Also, we would love to be able to hear from you as to future webinars that we could be able to go through and do. So if there's something that would, if we hear enough feedback from people asking for something that would be specific, like for example, cloud enablement, then that would be able to go through and help us be able to craft webinars that might go through and pique your curiosity.
Great. All right. Thanks, everybody. You have a good day.
Thank you.